There's two things I want to point out before we get started with this video. First, we're not going to be focusing on the back end, but at the end of this video, I'm going to give you all the tools you need to make sure the request looks right. So handling things like authentication when you're uploading a file, making sure that it works in native forms, things like that we'll cover at the end of this video. Now, the other thing is, if you want to get into the styling and the slots available to you with this component, then take a look at the Q input video. And the reason is the file component is almost the exact same as the Q input component. The only difference is that it deals with files, whereas Q input is dealing with like text or numbers, for example. All right, that's too much talk. Let's dive right in. First of all, we need a place to model our data. So let's say const file model and set that equal to a ref. We'll import ref there, and that'll just be nothing by default. Next, we'll come up here and say q-file and v-model our file model. There we go. Now let's see if it works. If I drag one of these photos down here onto the form, notice that we also get those little dotted borders around the outside to show that the dragging is working. We can drop that, and it's worked. File model is now going to be equal to the file that we just dropped on there. Let me quickly show you that. Pre-tag, and then we'll spit out here the file model. File model. Save it, and then once again, I'll drag a file on there, and there we go. It doesn't actually look like much in a pre-tag. You might want to console.log that, but don't worry, we'll be digging into this more later on in the video. Now, as I mentioned at the start, look at Q input if you want to know about all the styling and the slots, but we'll cover some of the basics. So this can be equal to something like file for the label. Another thing we can do is say that the color is equal to something like primary, and that means that when we drag and drop a file, yeah, you can see that you get like a bit of an underline there when it's focused with the primary color. We can make it filled to give it the filled style. We can make it rounded. We can also make it outlined. So let's come in here and say outlined. There's a whole bunch of things that we can do to style it. And there is one slot that I want to show you. So let's come down here, and that's the prepend slot. So template, let's come up here and say prepend. And the reason I'm showing you this slot is because I think you're almost going to want to have an icon at the start of this component so that the user can see that they need to drag a file onto there. So let's say q-icon, and we'll set the name of this icon equal to attach_file. And there we go. It's very obvious now that this is a file input form, whereas it's not as obvious if we don't have that slot. Okay, let's do some file specific stuff. We can say multiple here. And before I do that, let me just show you that if I try and drag multiple files onto here, it's only going to show one, and that's because only one is being modeled. But if we say multiple, save it, now I can drag multiple files and they all get modeled on there. So that's pretty cool. We can also say counter, and this is pretty awesome. It shows us how many files have been dragged on there and the total file size of all those files. So check this out. Now we get this extra information in the bottom right. So that's really handy to have. Another thing we can do is set the max files. Max-files, and let's set that equal to 3 in this example. And if I try and drag all those files on there, it's only going to grab the first 3, and you can see that by the commas. We can also set a label. So let's get rid of max files. Oh, actually, I might keep it in there because it'll be helpful for when we're doing the label. We can say counter-label and then give it a function, counter-label function, and this just gives us more control over what this label looks like. So let's put this function down here. There we go. And what's it going to accept? It's actually got a few things that we can pull out, like the file's number, the number of files, and we can say max files, and we can also say total size. So we've got a bit of information here that we can play around with. So now I could just return a template string, and let's send through files number, and then we'll do a slash sign, and we can send through the max files. So let's have a look at what that looks like. Save it. And yeah, there we go. If I drag one on, notice that it's going to update there. So if you want something simple, you could do that. Or to bring us back to the original example that we saw before, we could say like size, for example, and then put in parentheses here the total size. And we've got that here with total size. Save it. And there we go. So yeah, you want to play around with this a little bit. Oh, I think I need to say $. Yeah, there we go. Enter it correctly. And then drag a file on there. And now we've got some really nice feedback here, and we have total control over this. Okay, moving on. Let's get rid of that so we're back to a simpler example. Get rid of this too, and maybe the max files. And I'll also remove the counter. So next we're going to look at use-chips. Now this is really cool. I don't think I would ever use this component without use chips because it's so handy, especially when we're using multiple files. So if I grab all these files, drag them on there, notice that we get these chips and it follows the theme that we've set the color to. And we can easily close these out to get rid of some of the files. How cool is that? So the functionality here is fantastic and it just makes it way easier for the user. So I would almost always use chips. Another thing we can do is tap into the file slot. So let's come down here and say template and then file. And what this allows us to do is tap into each individual file. So for example, the Quasar logo and the Quasar logo stars, we could tap into those individually. And I'm going to pull out of here the scope. Or more specifically, actually, we might just pull out the file. Well, let's see if we can look at what the scope looks like first. Scope, and I'll throw that inside of a pre-tag, just so we can have a look at what's available to us, and then I'll drag a file on here. So we've got index, and we've also got the file itself. So index is particularly useful if you wanted to remove the file. So that remove functionality that we got with the QChip component, we can basically use the index to find it and easily remove it from our items in the array. So that's good to know. But for now, we just want to pull out the file. So let's yank that out. And then we'll come down here and let's just do an example here. How about q-chip? And we'll set the class equal to full width. And I'm also going to add some margining here. q-margin y and maybe extra small. And I'm going to square off the corners, just to sort of give you an example of what we can do. And we want to actually use the file here. So let's go ahead and spit that out, file.name, to get the name of the file. Okay, dragging one on. And there you go. Now we've got the name of the file inside of a chip, but I've just styled it a little bit differently than the use chips. Now the next bit I want to show you is a really cool example from the documentation. And what I want to do is make it so that a bar is at the start of this chip, and as the file uploads, it slowly makes its way to the end. So this isn't going to be a real example because it's a little bit involved and it's going to be different depending on how you upload your file. So we're just going to hard code the value, and I'll give you a starting point in case you want to build something like this. So let's say q-linear-progress. We'll use this component to basically show the progress going across the chip. And then inside of here, we're going to need a few classes. So let's say absolute-full. And this means that it's basically going to take up the full area of the chip, and then also full height to make sure it reaches to the top and bottom of the chip. So let's save that as a starting point. And after the chip, I'm going to add a div, and this div is going to have the file name in it. Here we go, file.name. What does that look like? Here's a starting point. Okay, so obviously we want to get this name inside of the chip, and we can do that by saying class is equal to relative-position. Save it, and now these two aren't going to clash with each other anymore, and therefore, all right, I've done something wrong here. Oh, okay, sorry, this needs to be inside of the chip. Let's give that a crack, see if it works. That's a very Australian saying, by the way. Give it a crack. I don't know where it comes from. It might be like, give it a crack of the whip, because there's whip cracking in Australia. I don't really know. Anywho, moving on. Let's try putting a value in here. Value is equal to 0.80, so 80% in other words. And let's throw one in there. And you can imagine that that's then uploaded to 80%. And you could play around with this to your heart's content. So you could change like the track color of the linear progress. You could change the background color of the text and style it exactly how you like it. But hopefully this is a good starting point for you if you do want to dig that much deeper into this component, adding in an upload progress so that the user's got that extra bit of feedback. And by the way, this will work with multiple files as well. So let's have a look at this. Yeah, and it shows us multiple files there. So the other slot that we have, I'm just going to comment this out for a moment. So let's comment that out. And we'll create a new slot here. And this is very similar to the file slot. It's called the selected slot. And this, once again, is specific to the file component. So you won't find this in the QInput component. This is specific to our QFile component. So now I can yank out the scope, and let's just have a look at that to see what we've got available to us. Drag a file on there. And there we go. It just tells us all of the files that we have available. So how about we yank out of here, oh, Butterfingers. Let's yank out of there, files, and now we can just iterate over them like this. So let's just do a div, keep it super simple for now. v-4 file in files. And how about we do this? We'll pull the index out of there so that we can easily set the key. The key is equal to whatever the index is. Key, index. Save it. Oop, cut that, paste it there. And let's see if that works. I'll just grab a few of them. Oh, there's nothing in this div. And then we need to actually get the name of the current file. File.name. And once again, we'll drag these files on there. And there you go. So the difference is, rather than an individual file, selected is giving us access to the entire area of where those files will be placed. So this just gives us slightly more control than accessing an individual file. This is basically saying, hey, for each file, I want to style it myself. This is saying I want to style the entire section where the files are shown. So to kind of join these two examples together, what you could do is, if we uncomment this out, let's just grab the chip part in the center here, and I'll get rid of that. And now let's paste those chips directly in there. And there we go. Since we're iterating over all of the files, file is now being set here in the loop, and then we're setting the file name here. So if I save that, we actually end up with something very similar to before. The difference being we now have more control over this because we're going from the outside in rather than dealing with each individual file. So there you have it. Let's get rid of all of this and bring us back to a simpler example. I'll get rid of the prepend as well. I like to keep things simple. We'll get rid of the chips, and that'll do. Next, I want to cover restrictions. So how can we restrict what the user sends through with a file? And this is really, really handy, and Quasar makes it quite simple. So first of all, we can use the native accept. So I'll send that through. And let's say we'll accept JPEGs. And another thing you can actually do is say comma, images, or image/all. You can give me a JPG file, or you can give me an image/any file. So really we could get rid of this and basically say, you can give me any kind of image and I'm going to accept it. So let's save it and try throwing these on there, and it works. Let's refresh the page now and try this Excel document. Nope, doesn't work. You can't send through an Excel document, has to be an image. Now, this way of restricting is best because this is passed directly. This is a native HTML attribute that's passed directly to the inner form. And that means it's going to work really nicely on mobile devices, for example. So maybe by saying image here, the mobile can then know, oh, this is only going to be an image file, so I'm going to open up the user's gallery so that they can select it with a better experience in the gallery component. I don't actually know if that works. I haven't tested it. You can give it a try and let me know what happens. I try to be thorough, but I just realized that I haven't tested that, so full disclosure. Okay, moving on. We've also got at rejected. So when this is rejected, we can tap into this to basically give a little bit of extra feedback to the user. Really handy. So now I can say, maybe we could notify the user. So let's jump into our quasar.config.js file and open our plugin section. Here we go, Quasar plugins. And I'm going to pull out the notify plugin to make that available in my application. Let's close that out now. And back here, I can now import notify from Quasar. And if we have any errors, we can now use the notify to basically show them. So let's come down here, and if it's rejected, we'll say on rejected. Let's create that function on rejected. And how about I pull out the rejection? Let's call it that. And we'll console.log that rejection for now, just to see what we're getting available to us. So I'll open up the console, drag this down a bit, and let's try throwing in an Excel document. So it gets rejected, and specifically, it's going to give us all of the files and say why they were rejected. So we get an array of all of the files that were rejected and some feedback on why those individual files were not accepted. So instead of calling this rejection, how about we call this rejected files? That's probably a better explanation for it. Now what we could do is say rejected files dot for each and rejected file. Now we could say notify dot create. We're going to create a notification with a message for each of those files. And we can now grab the rejected file. Oh, I wrote rejected filed. Let's double click that, Control D, rejected files. Make sure I fix that typo. We don't need this console.log anymore. And that's going to be the message, and it's rejected file. And what specifically do we want off here? Oh, here we go. Failed prop validation. So I guess I could say here, if rejected file dot failed prop validation. So if we have a value there, then we can notify a message here that says only images allowed. How about that? Let's save it and see if that works. There we go. Only images allowed. And I think I can set a color in here as well, or like a type. Yeah. And what types do I have? Maybe like negative or, yeah, actually I think it's negative. Negative. Save it. Let's try this again. And there we go. Now it comes up red. Only images allowed. Another thing we can do is set the maximum file size. So let's come up here and we can say max-file-size, and let's set that equal to something like 1000. And there we go. And let's see what happens now when I try and send a file through. Okay, it's saying only images allowed. So how about we come down here and failed prop validation. Okay, so it looks like we can do a check on this to see what response we want to give. How about we do this? Let's copy that, console.log it, and then try this again. All right, so this time it says max file size, whereas if it's a smaller file size, or how about this? We might need to make this number a bit larger just so we can pass that validation. Oh, how large does it have to be? All right, that's right. We want to put the Excel document in. All right, so now we get the accept error. So what we could do is this. We could have const errors maps, something like that, is equal to an object. One of them could be accept, and then we can say only images allowed. So if that's what it is, we say only images allowed. Where if it's the file size one, so max file size, we can come in here and say max file size. Then we say max file size exceeded, something like that. So this is something I like to do when I've got multiple errors. I like to create an errors map because it makes it really easy to just continually add errors on as your app becomes more sophisticated. And it just creates a nicer API when you're using it inside of the function. So I'll show you what I mean. Now I can say if we have an error, so if errors map, and then we can say rejected file dot failed prop validation. Actually, a better way to do this, let's cut that. How about we say const error message is equal to that. And then if we end up with an error message, so if we actually have an error message, then we'll do something. But if we don't have it, then I'm just going to return here. All right. Yeah, I think that's probably the cleanest way that I can think of right now off the top of my head. And now we need the message itself. So now we can just pass it directly through like that. Let's see if I did everything right there. Dragging this on, max file size exceeded, drag this one on, only images allowed. How cool is that? And then as you kind of build the functionality, you can just add it on to the errors map. So let's come up here. And apart from max file size exceeded, we've got another one called max total size exceeded. So we got max total size, and let's set that equal to 10,000. Okay, so if it's over 10,000, then we should get an error. And this one's going to be a slightly different error. So let's make sure we console.log this so we can see what the failed prop validation is. We can probably guess what it would be, but we'll console.log it anyway. And now if I try and drag one on, max total size. So max total size is different to max file size because it's saying the total size of all of the files can be a maximum of something, whereas max file size is talking about individual files. So max total size is the max of all the files. Max file size is for individual files. Okay, so let's copy paste this down and then say max total size, and then we can say max total file size exceeded. Let's see if we can get that error now. Oh, that worked. Okay, let's try adding all of these in. There we go, max total file size exceeded. How cool is that? Okay, moving on, what else can we do? Well, that's about it for the components. So now I'm going to switch to thinking about how we might shape our data so that we can upload it to a backend. And I've actually got a backend server. It's a Laravel server running in the background that we can use to basically test all of these different scenarios. So if you already know how to upload files, you can finish this video here. If you need a little bit of guidance, then stick along for the ride. Okay, so first of all, let's get rid of this function here. We're going to once again simplify things so that you can just focus on the code that matters. Get rid of that, and I'll get rid of all of this as well, so we're back to a simpler example. Next, we're going to be using a form to upload these files. So let's select that, Control-Shift-P. We're going to wrap that inside of a Q-form. And this Q-form, we want it to look a little bit like a card. So let's say class is equal to Q-padding or medium. So let's add padding to it. And we'll also add a shadow to it. So how about we say shadow dash maybe 2 or 3. There we go. So it kind of looks like a card now. I just wanted it to sort of stand out so we can expand on this example. Next, I want to easily be able to switch between single and multiple file uploads so that I can show you both. So what we'll use for that is a Q-button-toggle, and we're going to model whether or not it's multiple. So let's say multiple there, and then I can come down here and say const multiple is equal to a ref, and by default we'll say false. So by default, it's going to be single. All right, next we'll add some options in here, options, and we'll set that equal to an array. All right, and the options are basically just going to be multiple and single. So let's say the label here is multiple, and the value is true for that. And then we've got single, and the value for that is false. So this basically allows us to toggle multiple either equal to true if multiple selected, or multiple will be false if single is selected. So let's save that. And now we've got those buttons so we can easily toggle this variable. And the next thing I want to do is just a little bit of styling because I get a bit obsessed over this sort of thing. Unelevated. All right, that's looking good. Now I feel like I need a bit of bordering around there. So how about we say style is equal to border 1 pixel solid and E6. So like a grayish color. Yeah, I think that looks a bit better. It's sitting a little bit too close to the file. So how about we say class is equal to Q-margin bottom small. We'll margin the bottom a bit there. And just in case we add something to the top, how about we actually make that a margin X of small? Oh, sorry, not X, Y. So then we get margining on the top and the bottom. Now the last thing I want to do is basically clear this form when we change that value. So let's come in here and we'll say at update model dash value, and then we'll say, well, we're modeling, what are we modeling here? File model. We want this to be a form now. So before I do that, let's come down here and say form, and we'll set that equal to an object, and this form is going to have a file which will be null by default. So basically we're nesting file inside of a form object now because we're imagining using this inside of a form. So let's come back up here, and now I can say form.file is equal to null. So basically when we change this toggle, we're setting that to null. Let's refresh the page because it looks like I got some errors there. What's going on in here? We need to be modeling the right thing. Here we go. Form.file. Make sure we're modeling the file there. Refresh the page to check that error is gone. And it is. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. So I've kind of mentioned this before, but if you're looking for help related to the backend code, then you really do need to refer to the community or the documentation for the backend framework that you're working with. So the Quasar community is probably not the right place to ask questions about Laravel or about Django or about Nest.js. I mean, some people there might be able to help you, but you're probably going to get more luck looking in the community related to your backend framework. So I just wanted to make sure you're looking in the right direction there when you're doing backend code. Okay, so having said that, here are the three things that we're going to be covering, the three ways of uploading to a backend. The first one is with a native form. And so how do you know if you're dealing with a native form? And honestly, I can't actually tell you for sure unless I were to look at your backend, which I probably can't do for each of you individually. But here are a few tips to know if you want to do a native form submit. So native forms are not Ajax requests. So if you are not using an Ajax request, if you're submitting it to the page or if you're submitting it using the native form component, so for example, using action in here and using method inside of the form component, in that case, you want to use native form. So that's what I'm going to be covering first. And this is especially likely if you're using Quasar in UMD mode. So for example, if you're not using Quasar CLI and you're using UMD mode, and another indication of this might be that your backend is serving up your application's HTML. Those are a few indicators that you might be doing native form. Oh, and one more thing is if your application is not submitting to API/comments, for example, if it doesn't have this API part at the start, then it's likely to be a native form. If you've got API at the start, then it's probably not going to be a native form. Okay, so those are some indicators for whether or not it's a native form, and that's the first thing we'll talk about. Then we'll talk about immediate upload, and specifically using an Ajax request. So what this means is that when we first drag that file onto the form, it's going to upload straight away. And often what you'll do is you'll upload the file straight away, since that's quite an intensive operation. And then the backend is going to send you an ID. And then when you've finished filling in your form data, you can then use that file ID to basically connect it to the rest of the data in your form. So this is a common strategy where the moment you drop your file on there, it uploads it straight away. Now, the other thing that's kind of similar to that I'm going to cover, and the code for these two is pretty much the same, is an Ajax request on submit. And this basically means that you have a form that you're sending a file through to, but it doesn't upload until you press a submit button. So when you press that submit button, it then sends everything in the form to the server. These are the three ways that you might be dealing with uploading files. Okay, so let's cover the first one. Native form. Scrolling to the top, the first thing we're going to have to do here is set an action. So in my case, the action is equal to http:// localhost/upload. So that's the endpoint that I've set up for uploading files, and the method is going to be equal to a post. So this is a post request. Now, another thing that a lot of people forget, and this may actually depend on your backend, is you also need this enc type set to multipart/form-data. This is one of those things that you can Google if you really want to know the details of it, but I'm not going to go into the details in this video. All right, next, we need to have a button that's going to submit this form. So what we want is a button that is going to basically call the action on this form. And this is native HTML stuff. The stuff I'm showing you right now isn't really Quasar stuff. This is native HTML stuff. So behind the scenes, Quasar is sending these attributes to a form tag under the hood. All right, so basically we've got a form tag that's going to have all of these attributes set to. So let's get rid of that. And down here, we can now create the button, q-button. And now we have to set the type equal to submit. And let's give this a label equal to, well, submit. Then we can say class is equal to full width. And there it is. Let's also say q-margin top, maybe small. And I'll also set a color here equal to secondary. There we go. There is one more thing that's very important we need to do. So by default, if I submit this, nothing is actually going to be sent in that form. Any component that is inside of a native form also needs to have the name attribute. If the name attribute isn't set, then this form is not going to send anything when we press submit. So we need to set this equal to, in my case, the backend is expecting it to be called photo. So now I should be able to just drag this file on, cross my fingers, see if it all worked. And there we go. Looks like it did. That's sending me basically the public URL back so that I can then use it to display the photo. And if I jump into this public folder, let me get rid of all of those test files and we'll run this again. Send it through, submit, jump into this folder, and we can see that that worked. So there we go. Native submit is definitely the simplest example because basically the native HTML that the browser gives us is doing most of the work for us. It's kind of creating the form under the hood and submitting it without us needing to do anything. So we don't have to write any JavaScript, which is kind of cool. All right, let's click on back and try this with multiple. And I've basically set up my backend so that if this endpoint receives an array, then it's going to notice that and save an array of files. And if it's not an array, it'll save a single file. So I've handled all of that logic on the back end, meaning I should be able to come into pictures and send through an array here, submit. Oh, did I go to single? Let's try this again. Get rid of that. Multiple. And it looks like, oh, okay, so we created this button toggle, but we didn't actually implement any logic for it. All right, so let's copy paste this QFile down. And then the first one will say v-if it is not set to multiple, and then a v-else for this one. And then we'll set multiple here. There we go. All right, so let's just refresh the page to make sure that's fresh and try that again. Drag those on. All right, looks like it's working now. Submit it. Oh, and there is one more thing I need to point out. We need to set the name to an array like this for it to work. This is basically telling the backend this is going to be an array of photos. So with multiple, we have that array sign, but with a single file, we don't have that array sign. So let's see if it's right this time. Yeah, see, this kind of thing can be really finicky, which is why I'm building this video. Let's go back to multiple. Try sending the files through. Submit. And there we go. Now all of them have been uploaded. How cool is that? So this is one of the benefits of using native HTML. I mean, a lot of this stuff is just a lot easier. But most of you are probably building SPAs and you want to do Ajax requests to send these files through. So let's have a look at how we might do that. First, I'll move us back to a simpler example. So we'll get rid of the method and the action and the ENC type, which I think stands for encryption type. I actually don't know, to be honest. Don't tell anyone, though. I want everybody to think that I'm really smart. All right, so that was native form. Let's have a look at immediate upload. And we're going to need a little bit of code to do this. So this will be fun. Let's dive in. First, we need a function for making our form, which is basically preparing the data. So we'll say make form here, and we'll accept a file. And this file could be a single file or an array. So we're going to set it up so it's going to check if it's an array. And if it's an array, we'll do it in such a way that it will work with an array of photos. Otherwise, we'll do it in such a way that it works with just a single photo. Photo, file, depending on your example. Now we say const data is equal to new form data. And this is going to allow us to easily create a form with files mingled into it. So now I can come down here and say if array.isArray file, so if the file that was passed through to this make form function is an array, then we're going to iterate over all of those files. So file.forEach, and then we grab the current file. So now that we're iterating over every file, we can append them to the data. And we do it like this. Data.append, and then we send through photo, and we let it know that it's an array of photos. That part's important. It might depend on your backend, but at least for the backends I use, this is important, adding these array brackets in there. So next we send through the current file. Now you might be thinking, well, is this just going to be overwritten every single time the array runs? And that's actually not the case. With data.append, you can almost think of this as like building up an array of photo values that are going to be equal to the current file. All right, that's why it's append, and it's not like a replace or it's not a set function. It's an append function. But anyway, you can forget I said that. Now we can say else. So if it's not an array, we can assume we're dealing with a single file. Data.append, And photo, notice that we do not have the brackets when we're dealing with a single photo. And then we send through the file. And in this case, we also want the file name. So we say file.name. Save it. And there we go. That's the crux of it, this make form function. Next, we need a function for actually submitting the form. We're going to make this an async function, which is usually what you want. So you can do loading spinners and all that kind of fancy stuff. And we'll call this submit form. Okay, now we'll say const file. I want an easy way to access the file. Form.value.file. And this might be an array, which is okay because we deal with whether or not it's an array inside of this block of code. Okay, so we have the file. And now we also want to know where we're posting this to. So I'll say const URL is equal to, and my backend for that is localhost. And this one is going to be API/upload. So the one before was upload, which is often what it's going to look like with a normal web application that doesn't have an API that's separate. However, when you're building something like an SPA, you're usually going to have it nested in something like API. Or it might actually be something like this, my-API/upload, or API.my-app/upload. It might also look something like that. Anyway, moving back here, localhost/API/upload. Now we can say await, and we're going to use fetch, but if you're using Axios, don't worry, because I'm going to show you how to use Axios in a second. It's pretty much the same thing. So now we can say fetch, pass through the URL, and then send through an object for all of our fetch data. We want the body to be equal to make form. So now we're using this make form function we made before, and we'll send it through the file. Next, we want to set the method here. And of course, this is going to be a post. Or I think it might be like a put, or if it's an update, it might be a patch. But chances are this is just going to be a post. So let's save that. And I think that's about it. That's all the functionality. Now what we can do is come up here and then say, if I click on here and alt-click down here, at update model-value. So when this changes, I want you to call the submit form function. All right, let's see if this works, but let me quickly just run through what's happening. When the file changes, we call submit form. And by the way, when the file changes, the model of file is also going to change because it's being modeled up here. Okay, so it changes, we call submit form. And here is where we actually grab the file out of that form. And then we make a post request to my endpoint where I'm uploading the files. For the body of our post request, we're going to use this make form function that we created earlier. And if it's an array of files, then we're going to deal with that. Otherwise, we'll just deal with a single file. Oh, I almost forgot something crucial here. We then need to return the data. Oh gosh, that would have been an annoying mistake, because if otherwise this just returns void, and that would be equal to nothing, which would have made the whole thing useless. Okay, so there we go. I think everything is set up. Let's try it with a single file. Cross our fingers, say a prayer if you're religious, and then submit. All right, something funky happened. It looks like that submitted it to the page. So let's scroll up here. The other thing I need to do is get rid of this button. That's right. We're not using submit anymore. We're just drag and dropping it directly on. So let me click on here and open our network tab so I can actually check that this is submitted. Running out of space. Drag this on here, and there we go. It automatically submitted behind the scenes. Let me get rid of all of these files and just check that it's working again. So we'll refresh the page. And all I have to do now is drag and drop a file on there, and it's automatically sent to my backend. How cool is that? I love it. So let's go ahead and delete this file and see if it works with multiple files as well. So let's see if this block of multiple, is array code actually works. And we click on multiple here, send them through, and let's see if it worked. And it did. So there we go. Now we can send multiple files to the backend by simply dragging and dropping it directly onto the file input. Now, the next thing I want to show you is how to wait until the user actually submits the form. And this is good because it means that we can easily have more data in the form, like a title or like a body for a comment. Oh, okay, refreshing the page. Let's scroll up here. It's actually not going to be very different. instead of an at update model value, we're not going to call that. We'll come down here, we'll have a q-button, and then we can say at click, and this time we wait until it's clicked, and then we submit the form. So I'll copy that code. So when this button is clicked, we submit the form, and the label of this is going to be submit. Save it, and I believe that's all we need to do. Oh, that looks ugly. Class is equal to full dash width, and then the color is equal to secondary, and I'll also add a q dash margin top of small. All right, there we go. So now let's drag one of these files on here, and it doesn't submit by default. Oop, let me just delete all of these to prove that. And now when we click on submit, something funky's going on. Let's try this again. What have I done wrong here? Submit. Okay, looks like it went through that time. Let's try it again with multiple. And then we'll grab more files, drag them on, submit. And there we go. Now they're all being sent through. Whew, okay, this is really cool. Now, the last thing I want to show you in this video is adding more to the field. Because chances are you're not just uploading the file in this scenario where you've got this submit button. You probably have a title as well. So let's come up here. And it might be a title, it might be a body, it could be anything. Let's say q-input v-model is equal to form.title. So I'll add that into the form in a second. We'll say the label is equal to title, and we'll make this field. Save it, and there we go. Now we've got the title showing up there. Gosh, I love Quasar. It just makes things beautiful by default. So now we can come down here and make sure we have this form.title. Scrolling down. By default, I'll set the title equal to an empty string. So that should be modeling correctly now. Let's come down here and make sure it gets added to the form. So what we can do is say data.append when we're making the form, and I want to append a title, and I want to set that to form.value.title. All right, so basically the title, which is modeled here, gets sent through, it gets appended to our form as title. Okay, so that's done. I think that might be it. Let's test if it works. Title is equal to beep, and then let's send through a file. And I want to open the network tab so I can actually check that that worked correctly. Ooh, what's going on here with this network tab? I might have to open that up again. Okay, there we go. So let's enter that data again. Oh, and it's the drag and dropping. It's making this weird thing come up. All right, so let's just try this one more time. Close that. Open it up again. This time I'm going to go around it when I drag it in. All right. And then we'll give this a title of beep and submit the form. Looks like it still worked, but this time, I might just go full screen here. We can see that the title has also been sent through. So that's about it for this video. We went through a lot of stuff. Not only did we go through the component, we also looked at how we make a form and then use that form that we made to basically inject some files and then also send them to the backend. Oh, and I was actually going to show you Ajax as well. Oh, actually, there's a couple of things I wanted to show you. So there's a couple of other problems that you might run into when you're using fetch, and one of those is including credentials. In other words, if you're using cookies for authentication, chances are you want to do this. You want to say credentials is equal to true. So that's one thing you might need to know when you're using fetch. Another one is the mode. So you might have to set the mode equal to CORS, and you've got a few other options there. Let me just show you the list of options that we've got. CORS, close that out. You've got navigate, no CORS, and same origin. And so you might want to change the mode as well, depending on your application. And this one is really important. You might want to send some headers as well. For example, the most common one is going to be an authorization header. And you might want to send through your bearer token. So for example, bearer, and then you might send through a token like this. There's a very good chance that you're going to have to do this to make sure your authenticated user is identifiable when you upload the file. In fact, you're almost certainly going to do either this or credentials is equal to true. Now, let's have a look at this using Ajax. I've already installed Ajax in the background. If you need to do it too, you can say yarn add Ajax to go ahead and install that. And then when that's installed, you can come in here and say import Ajax from Ajax. And the API is very, very similar. So Let me just create some space here. Refresh the page, so we're ready to go. Instead of await fetch, we say await axios.post. Now we're going to post to this URL that we saved earlier. And the next thing we need to do is send through some data. So we can simply say make form and send through the file. It's pretty much the exact same. It's just like a different formatting of how we send it through. We're saying axios.post instead of just adding all of the options into the fetch function. Anywho, so URL, the form itself, and then we can send through some options if we need them. For example, we might need with credentials, so you can set that to true if you're sending cookies. Another thing you might need to do is set headers, and you can say, for example, header is equal to authorization, and then you can say bearer and send through your token. So as you can see, this is very similar to when you're using fetch. Now we don't actually have a token, so that's going to squawk at me. But let's get rid of all of this and just double check that it is also working with Axios. Dragging a file on there, submit, and it looks like it did work. So let's just double check that it did. We'll submit that again. And there we go, it did. Yeah, we can see a lot of these files are being sent through. I'll submit that one more time just to prove it. Yeah. Cool. So now it's working with Axios. I showed you how to do it with fetch. I showed you how to set authorization headers. I showed you how to set with credentials to true just in case you're using cookie authentication, which is another common way to authenticate. And I also showed you how to append other data to the form. For example, a text with a title. So there we go. That's the end of this video on using Quasar's QFile component for uploading files. I hope you found this useful. I really spent a lot of time working on this video to make sure that I covered a whole lot of different backends, to make sure that it was as easy as to understand as I could possibly make it with something as, finicky as uploading files. So please do let me know if you found this useful in the comments, and I'll see you in a future video.